The YN is the youngest person in a street hierarchy, typically between 16 and 22 years old. He occupies the bottom of the structure, running packages, holding work, standing on corners, and absorbing legal consequences when operations fail. He is the most visible member of the organization and the most disposable, while those above him remain insulated from the risk he takes. Respect is the only currency the structure has shown him to want, and the fastest way to accumulate it is to prove publicly and repeatedly that he is not soft. This is the behavioral profile before I enter astrology. The astrological signature of the YN begins with Mars in a compromised position. Mars rules drive to act, the impulse towards aggression, and the mechanism of pursuit. When Mars is in its fall, which is Cancer, the drive to act is filtered through emotions and fear of rejection. So aggression never moves in a straight line. When Mars is in detriment in Libra, the impulse to fight pauses to assess whether everyone involved is comfortable, and that hesitation is a liability on the street. Mars combusts, conjunct the Sun within a few degrees, burns at such intensity that it loses its ability to modulate itself. The most instructive signature for the YN is Mars, in hard aspect to Saturn, which describes someone whose aggression is enormous while the consequences of that aggression have not yet arrived. The YN operates in the gap between those two realities until one of them closes. The house Mars occupies refines this picture. A YN with Mars in Aries in the first house charges directly and visibly, making himself the face of every confrontation. A YN with Mars in Aries in the 12th house is more secretive and paranoid, and because the 12th house governs hidden enemies and self undoing, is strategically more likely to be caught by forces he never saw coming. A YN with Mars in the 4th house act out wound from his family origin, and the street becomes the arena where he tries to resolve something that started at home before he was old enough to understand. The wound belongs to the moon. The moon governs emotional need, the hunger for belonging, and the internalized template of family. When the YN's biological family was absent, inadequate, or emotionally unavailable, his moon registered the absence as a structural fact about the world, and the crew became the corrective. The moon in hard aspect to Saturn describes someone who learned early that emotional needs were punished or ignored, and who subsequently built his identity around not appearing to need anything while desperately needing what the crew offers. The moon in Capricorn cools the emotional body until vulnerability becomes accessible only through crisis. The moon in the 4th house or 12th house places the wound close to the surface, driving behavior that looks like aggression but is actually the pursuit of safety. Mars is what the YN does. The moon is why he does it. Neptune introduces the third variable. Neptune rules delusion, escapism, and the confusion that makes a person believe he is invincible or the rules govern everyone else does not apply. A YN with Neptune square acts under a distorted understanding of his surrounding. Whether that distortion comes from substances, from the mythology of the crew, or from dissociation as a survival mechanism. He may follow orders he does not fully understand. He may hold work for people whose actual interests are invisible to him. He operates inside a structure that depends on his confusion to function. The 8th house is the architectural container for the YN's position. The 8th house governs shared resources, other people's money, debt, and death. The YN holds products that belong to someone else. He absorbs the risk disproportionate to his share of profit. His life expectancy is statistically shortened by the position he occupies. The debt he owes the crew of putting him on is never formally calculated and never fully repaid. Planets in the 8th house clarify the specific nature of his entanglement within the structure. The question that separates a surviving YN from one who does not is whether he reaches his Saturn return and what form that reckoning takes. The Saturn return occurs between ages 27 and 30, marking the first time Saturn returns to his birth position. Every structure built on recklessness, borrowed time, or someone else's protection gets pressure tested against what it can actually sustain. For the YN, this is when the street either formalizes or finishes him. If the Mars energy that drove him in teenage years has matured into something with strategy underneath, he survives and begins the transition towards the thug. If not, the Saturn return is where the arrest record becomes permanent. Losses accumulate beyond what the network can absorb, and the thing he was outrunning finally stops waiting. A concrete example, and with Mars in Aries square Saturn in Capricorn, will pick fights he cannot win. Mars in the home sign of Aries operates at full strength and wants glory above everything. Saturn in its home sign of Capricorn quietly builds the invoice for every undisciplined move. The square ensures those forces remain in active tension until one wins. Astrology cannot neutralize external systems. A YN with Mars in Aries square Saturn in Capricorn in a hyper police black neighborhood faces institutional consequences that the same planetary configuration in a suburban white drug market does not produce with the same frequency or severity. The astrology describes the internal architecture. The carceral state determines what happens when that architecture contacts law enforcement. The planets do not change based on race. The thug is what the YM becomes when he survives the first Saturn return and emerging having absorbed what Pluto demands. The transition is not about acquiring new skills, but about fundamental change in relationship to power, secrecy, and knowledge that accumulates only through witnessing what cannot be unseen. Scorpio governs that territory. The thug Mars is more likely to be exalted in Capricorn or in a strong aspect of Pluto, producing a drive that is disciplined and patient rather than explosive and visible. He does not perform authority for an audience. His presence communicates without performance. The thug chart is distinguished from the YN by what has been integrated. Where the YN Saturn aspect describes unresolved tension between aggression and consequences, the thug has lived through the resolution and reorganized around it. His Saturn placements are no longer a pending reckoning, but the structure of discipline that makes him functional. Pluto aspects describe the depth of his transformation. The paranoia belonging to Scorpio's shadow is his primary liability. The same capacity for secrecy and strategy that made him effective also makes it structurally difficult to trust anyone enough to form protective alliances. The thug has a Saturn return between ages 56 and 60. The first return tested whether reckless early structure could survive accountability. The second tests whether the structure built on discipline and enforcement has the loss of physical capacity and institutional fear that currently sustain him. Younger members are always accumulating credibility to take his position. The second Saturn return is where the thug either transforms into a different kind of power or becomes vulnerable to the displacement he once represented. The OG carries the combined signature of Capricorn and Pluto. He sits atop a structure built by other people's labor and risk, while his own hands stay insulated from direct contact with the work. Jupiter belongs here as well, governing expansion, empire, and accumulation beyond survival. The OG's capacity to build something that outlasts any individual transaction is a Jupiterian function. The 10th house, governing public standing, legacy, and institutional authority, describes his platform. Strong 10th house placements combined with Pluto aspect produce someone who understands how to use structural position to generate and sustain power across long time horizons. Fixed sign energy, whether Taurus, Leo, or Scorpio, or Aquarius, appears regularly because fixed signs hold what they have built and resist displacement with a stubbornness cardinal and mutable signs do not sustain. The OG has survived multiple Saturn returns, and that survival is the credential. Each return reorganizes his operation around a new structural reality rather than destroying it. What reads as invulnerability is the result of being pressure tested repeatedly and building each time more durable versions of the same fundamental structure. The corporate parallel hierarchy is identical across street and institutional contexts. Only the setting and vocabulary changes. The YN is the entry level employee who absorbs visible risk and takes blame for failures originating above him. The thug is a middle manager who enforces policy and handles situations that would damage the executive reputation if seen near them. The OG is the executive who built his position on the labor and the risk of everyone below him and frames that arrangement as meritocracy. The astrology governing each role does not shift context, and neither does the structural relationship. The consequences are not equivalent. The YN goes to prison while the intern goes home. The thug gets buried or locked while the middle manager receives a severance package.